Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. You've heard of Harriet Tubman, secret tunnels, and coded quilts. But how much of that is actually true? The Underground Railroad has taken on an almost mythical status in American history. A shadowy network of hidden passageways, brave abolitionists, and enslaved people risking everything for freedom. But the truth is far more complex, and often more powerful than the legends we've grown up hearing. Today, we're uncovering the real story behind the Underground Railroad. Who really ran it? What risks did people take? Were there actually secret codes sewn into quilts? And how did this network of escape and resistance change the course of American history? This story isn't just about heroism in the past. It's about how ordinary people defied a brutal system and reshaped a nation's conscience. Understanding the true history of the Underground Railroad helps us grasp not only the horrors of slavery, but the power of solidarity, resistance, and hope in the darkest of times. So let's separate fact from fiction and dive deep into one of the most compelling chapters of American history. By the early 1800s, slavery had become deeply entrenched in the southern United States, expanding rapidly alongside the cotton economy. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton immensely profitable, and that demand drove the expansion of slavery westward into newly acquired territories. States like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana saw booming plantation systems that relied entirely on enslaved labor. What had once been a brutal institution mostly confined to the eastern seaboard now stretched deep into the American interior. For the enslaved, life was harsh beyond comprehension. Families were regularly torn apart through sales with no legal rights or protections. Enslaved people were considered property, bought, sold, inherited. They labored from sunup to sundown in fields, often under the watch of overseers who used violence to enforce discipline. Punishments for even perceived disobedience could be severe: whipping, branding, and in some cases, mutilation. There was no protection from physical or sexual abuse. Food was basic and often inadequate. Medical care was rare. And despite these conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist. Through work slowdowns, escape attempts, preserving cultural traditions, and building communities rooted in resilience. While slavery became more entrenched in the South, the North was heading in a different direction. Though racism still existed there, many northern states had begun abolishing slavery in the late 1700s and early 1800s. This shift gave rise to a growing abolitionist movement, a diverse coalition of free Black Americans, religious leaders, writers, former slaves, and white allies who believed slavery was a moral evil that had to be ended. Figures like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth emerged as powerful voices, using speeches, newspapers, and books to expose the horrors of slavery to a wider audience. These activists didn't just speak out. They took bold, often dangerous action. Many risked their safety, reputations, and livelihoods by directly aiding enslaved people in their escape. Some provided safe houses, others acted as guides, and many organized or joined anti-slavery societies to challenge the legal and moral foundations of slavery itself. Their defiance often put them at odds with federal and state laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Acts, which criminalized assistance to runaway slaves and compelled even those in free states to participate in their capture. As the divide between the North and South deepened, with the South determined to preserve slavery, and the North increasingly home to abolitionist voices, the stage was set for a movement that operated outside the bounds of the law. It was in this hostile and polarized climate that the Underground Railroad emerged. Though it had no tracks or locomotives, it functioned like a railroad, coordinated, clandestine, and reliant on a vast network of conductors, stations, and brave souls willing to risk everything. What made the Underground Railroad so extraordinary wasn't just its scale. It was the shared sense of purpose that united free Black citizens, formerly enslaved individuals, white allies, and religious communities like the Quakers. At the heart of this shadowy, decentralized operation was a single, unshakable belief: that freedom was worth fighting for, and that no human being should be treated as property. In every route taken and every life saved, the Underground Railroad was a quiet rebellion, an act of resistance fueled by empathy, daring, and a vision of a more just world. Freedom seekers were not just nameless figures in history. They were real people, with real lives, dreams, and extraordinary bravery. Each escape was a personal revolution. Some ran alone, some with family, and many left everything behind, for a chance at something they had never truly known. Freedom. One of the most well-known freedom seekers is Henry Box Brown. In 1849, after the death of his wife and children who were sold away from him, Brown hatched a daring plan. He had himself shipped in a wooden crate from Virginia to Philadelphia, a journey that took 27 hours. He emerged from that box a free man. It was a moment of sheer desperation and genius, risking suffocation and capture just to breathe free air. Then there's Ellen and William Craft, a married couple from Georgia. Ellen, who was light-skinned, disguised herself as a white man, her servant William posing as her slave, and they traveled openly by train and boat all the way to the north. Their story is not just a tale of escape, but a bold subversion of the racial and gender norms that slavery was built on. Harriet Jacobs, another powerful figure, spent 7 years hiding in a tiny crawl space above a shed to avoid the sexual violence of her enslaver and to eventually reach freedom for herself and her children. Her account, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is one of the most vivid portrayals of what enslaved women endured and the lengths they would go to resist. Every journey was perilous. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, especially at night, armed and authorized to stop, search, and brutalize anyone they suspected of being a fugitive. Bounty hunters were paid handsomely for returning runaways, and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act meant even reaching the North didn't guarantee safety. Escaped people could be captured and sent back at any moment, often with severe punishment awaiting them. Freedom seekers also had to navigate a landscape filled with uncertainty. Who could they trust? Some were betrayed by those they thought were allies. Others were aided by total strangers willing to risk everything. It took more than just courage. It took careful planning, luck, and the determination to survive in a system designed to break their spirits. But their journey sent shockwaves far beyond the paths they traveled. Every person who escaped slavery struck a blow against the institution that had bound them. Each successful flight was a direct challenge to the system's authority and a living, breathing contradiction to the lie that enslaved people were content, passive, or incapable of self-determination. Their stories of courage, cunning, and relentless will became powerful tools for the abolitionist movement. First-hand accounts published in newspapers, speeches given at rallies, and narratives shared in churches and meeting halls stirred the hearts and minds of those who had once looked away. These stories humanized the abstract cruelty of slavery and made the injustice impossible to ignore. At the same time, every escape infuriated slaveholders and intensified the South's demands for stricter laws and harsher enforcement. The tension between free and slave states grew sharper, the divisions more irreconcilable. In this way, the journeys of those who fled did more than secure freedom. They helped expose the moral rot at the heart of American society. The bravery of these individuals didn't just alter the course of their own lives, it shifted the conscience of a nation. Their resistance forced America to confront the brutal reality of slavery and laid the groundwork for the growing call to end it altogether. The Underground Railroad was not powered by tracks or steam engines. It was powered by human conviction, compassion, and courage. It was a network forged not by machines, but by people, farmers, ministers, formerly enslaved individuals, shopkeepers, and students, who became conductors, station masters, and allies in a quiet war for justice. Many were just ordinary folks who made extraordinary choices, risking fines, imprisonment, even death, to help others reach freedom. This underground network transcended race, class, and geography. Black and white, rich and poor, urban and rural, they worked together, bound by a shared belief that slavery was a moral evil and that no law could justify the denial of a person's humanity. Safe houses became stations, code words guided secret travel, and trust became the only currency that mattered. At its heart, the Underground Railroad was a radical act of defiance against a system built on oppression. It showed that freedom was not just a philosophical ideal, but a tangible right, one worth fighting for, hiding for, and sometimes dying for. And through every whisper, every hidden path, and every brave decision made in silence, this people-powered movement carved out a legacy of resistance that still inspires today. Harriet Tubman is often the first name we hear in connection with the Underground Railroad, and for good reason. But her real story goes far beyond the simplified legend. Born into slavery in Maryland, Tubman escaped in 1849. But instead of staying safe in the North, she returned, not once, not twice, but an estimated 13 times, to rescue more than 70 enslaved people, including her own family. She was armed, strategic, and fearless. Tubman used the cover of night, coded songs, disguises, and a deep understanding of the terrain to outwit slave catchers. And she was so effective that a bounty of $40,000 was once placed on her head, a staggering sum at the time. Later, during the Civil War, she would become a Union spy and military leader, the only woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, liberating over 700 enslaved people in a single raid. While Harriet Tubman is one of the most iconic figures of the Underground Railroad, she was part of a much larger network of committed individuals who believed in the fundamental right to freedom. Among the most steadfast allies in this movement were the Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends, whose deep-rooted values of equality, peace, and justice compelled them to take action against slavery. Quaker theology rejected hierarchy and the concept of inherent superiority, whether in matters of religion, race, or social class. To them, the idea that one human could own another was a moral abomination, fundamentally incompatible with their faith. This belief wasn't just theoretical, it translated into direct action. Many Quakers opened their homes, their barns, and their hearts to people escaping bondage, often in defiance of harsh laws like the Fugitive Slave Acts that criminalized such aid. Levi Coffin, a Quaker merchant originally from North Carolina, who later settled in Indiana and then Ohio, became one of the most influential figures in this network. Alongside his wife Catherine, Coffin transformed their home into a crucial station on the Underground Railroad, so well known and well organized that he was dubbed the president of the system. The Coffins didn't just offer shelter, they provided food, clothing, medical care, and vital information, helping escapees make their way farther north, often into Canada where slavery was outlawed. It's estimated that Levi and Catherine Coffin directly assisted more than 3,000 people seeking freedom. They didn't act out of political ambition or the desire for recognition. They acted out of a profound sense of duty rooted in their religious convictions. Their commitment was unwavering, even as their actions attracted attention and danger. Slave catchers knew the Coffin House was a haven, yet the couple persisted, undeterred by threats or legal consequences. The involvement of Quakers like the Coffins illustrates the collaborative, interwoven nature of the Underground Railroad. It was not a singular effort, but a collective one, built on trust, guided by conscience, and sustained by ordinary people who chose to do what was right, even when it was illegal. Their legacy reminds us that moral courage often requires quiet, persistent resistance, and that true faith in justice demands action. Free Black communities played a vital, often under-recognized role in the success of the Underground Railroad. Positioned in both urban centers and rural areas, these communities served as essential lifelines for freedom seekers, offering not only immediate aid but also long-term support. Unlike many white allies who often operated within insulated circles or religious groups, free Black individuals and families lived with the daily reality that their own freedom was tenuous, and yet they still chose to risk everything to help others escape bondage. These communities were often the first point of contact for fugitives. They provided food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and critically, information, directions, contacts, and advice on how to evade slave catchers or navigate unfamiliar terrain. Many also helped freedom seekers integrate into new lives, whether that meant finding work, securing housing, or reconnecting with family members lost to the slave trade. One of the most remarkable figures from this network was William Still, a free Black man living in Philadelphia. Often called the father of the Underground Railroad, Still worked as an abolitionist and a clerk at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. What made Still so significant was not just his role in helping hundreds of people escape slavery, it was the way he preserved their stories. Still kept detailed records of the individuals who passed through Philadelphia, carefully documenting names, ages, backgrounds, and destinations. He recognized that the stories of these men, women, and children were more than personal. They were historical. His meticulous record-keeping later became the foundation for his book, The Underground Railroad, one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts we have of the people who used and operated this secretive system. Still's work not only helped reunite families torn apart by slavery. His records allowed some escapees to find loved ones years later, but it also preserved the human dimension of the movement. His book gives voice to those who might otherwise have been forgotten, reminding us that the fight for freedom was waged not only in the shadows, but also in the memories and words of those who lived it. Free Black communities and individuals like William Still weren't just participants in the Underground Railroad. They were its backbone. Their courage, organizational skill, and deep-rooted commitment to justice ensured that the promise of freedom became a reality for thousands, even in the face of enormous risk. What's often overlooked in the story of the Underground Railroad is the vital, though less widely recognized, role that Native American communities played in resisting slavery. In certain regions, especially in the Southeast, Native nations provided refuge, support, and in some cases, formed deep, lasting alliances with people fleeing enslavement. These relationships were complex, shaped by regional dynamics, cultural exchanges, and the pressures of colonization and displacement, but they represent a crucial layer of the broader resistance to slavery. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Florida, where escaped slaves found sanctuary among the Seminole people. Over time, these fugitives and their descendants became part of a unique cultural group known as the Black Seminoles. This blended community, formed from African and Native heritage, not only lived together but also fought side by side against U.S. military forces during the Seminole Wars. For the Black Seminoles, joining with the Seminole Nation wasn't just about safety, it was about forging a new identity rooted in freedom, resistance, and survival. These alliances weren't always widespread or uniform. Some Native nations, under pressure or seeking favor with the U.S. government, sided with slaveholding interests or even adopted slavery themselves. But others chose a different path, offering protection and forging solidarity with those who were also resisting the forces of white supremacy and territorial conquest. These stories challenge the conventional, binary narratives of race in American history. They show that the fight against slavery was not confined to Black and white communities. It spanned racial and cultural boundaries and was part of a much larger web of resistance against oppression. The connections between Native and African-descended peoples, especially in places like Florida, reveal how deeply intertwined their struggles for autonomy, land, and dignity really were. Recognizing this overlooked history helps paint a fuller picture of the Underground Railroad, not as a fixed, linear route, but as a broad, evolving network of resistance that drew strength from unexpected places and unlikely alliances. It reminds us that the pursuit of freedom has always been a collective struggle, enriched by diverse voices and united by shared purpose. Many of the heroes of the Underground Railroad remain in the shadows of history, their bravery and contributions, often overlooked in favor of more widely known figures. Yet it was these lesser-known individuals, operating quietly, often anonymously, who made the Underground Railroad function day after day, person by person. Laura Haviland, for instance, was a white abolitionist whose commitment to ending slavery was so fierce that she went far beyond the expected bounds of activism. Based in Michigan, she not only opened her home to freedom seekers, but also took enormous personal risks by traveling into the heart of slave territory. Disguised and operating undercover, Haviland entered plantations in the Deep South in attempts to locate and rescue enslaved people. Her actions defied both legal and social norms of the time, and she was frequently targeted by slave catchers and pro-slavery mobs. Despite the danger, she continued her work for decades, driven by her belief in the moral urgency of abolition. John Parker, on the other hand, brought a very different perspective to the movement, one forged from personal experience. Born into slavery, Parker eventually purchased his own freedom and settled in Ripley, Ohio, a town just across the river from Kentucky, a slave state. From there, he became one of the most daring conductors on the Underground Railroad. Under the cover of night, he would cross the Ohio River into Kentucky, often alone, and guide enslaved individuals to safety, sometimes carrying them, sometimes hiding them in false bottom wagons, always risking capture and death. Parker's ingenuity, courage, and first-hand understanding of the system he fought against made him one of the most effective operatives in the region. He is believed to have helped hundreds reach freedom, and later in life he shared his experiences in a memoir that offers a rare, vivid look into the inner workings of the railroad from someone who lived it. These individuals, Haviland, Parker, and countless others whose names may never be known, reveal the Underground Railroad for what it truly was: a decentralized movement powered by personal conviction and collective bravery. Their stories expand our understanding of the resistance to slavery, reminding us that behind every successful escape was a network of people willing to risk everything for the sake of justice and human dignity. This was not a centralized system with maps and formal schedules. It was a living, breathing resistance movement, made up of countless unnamed individuals who opened their homes, risked their livelihoods, and believed that helping someone escape bondage was worth whatever price they might pay. Without them, the railroad never would have run. When we think of the Underground Railroad, images of secret codes and hidden signals often come to mind: lanterns in windows, cryptic songs, and quilts hanging on fences with mysterious patterns. But what was real and what's become legend over time? Communication was absolutely vital to the Underground Railroad, especially because it was illegal, dangerous, and constantly under threat. Messages had to be subtle, hidden in plain sight, because a single slip could mean capture, imprisonment, or death. One of the most reliable and widely used methods was songs. Spirituals and folk songs, passed down orally, often contained coded messages. For example, "Follow the Drinking Gourd" wasn't just a song about a gourd. It was a navigational guide. The Drinking Gourd referred to the Big Dipper constellation, which points to the North Star. Freedom seekers could use it to find their way north. Lyrics in the song gave clues about the best time to travel and where to find help along the way. Lanterns in windows or certain colors of cloth hung outside homes could also be used as visual signals to indicate that a house was a station, a safe place to hide. Some homes had hidden compartments, trapdoors, or false walls, while others relied simply on timing and watchfulness to move people quickly and quietly to the next stop. Now, the idea of quilt codes has become one of the most popular and romanticized parts of Underground Railroad lore. According to the story, quilts were stitched with specific patterns, like the log cabin, flying geese, or bear's paw, and hung outside to communicate messages, directions, warnings, or safe passage. It's a powerful image, but the historical evidence for quilt codes is limited and widely debated among scholars. While it's possible that quilts played a symbolic or practical role in some instances, there's little documentation from the time to confirm that they were systematically used for coded messaging. Most of what we know about the quilt theory comes from oral traditions passed down much later, particularly in the 20th century. What we do know is that oral tradition itself was crucial. Because most enslaved people were forbidden from reading and writing, knowledge had to be shared by word of mouth. Elders, trusted allies, and fellow escapees passed along advice, routes, and signals through whispered stories, songs, and face-to-face conversations. Geography was another vital tool. Rivers, mountains, and even the position of moss on trees could serve as directional guides. Some freedom seekers traveled at night to avoid detection, using natural landmarks to stay on course. The brilliance of the Underground Railroad wasn't in elaborate spy gadgets or master codes. It was in the creativity, the resourcefulness, and the cultural knowledge passed from one person to another. In a time when any wrong move could mean disaster, these subtle forms of communication became lifelines, stitching together a quiet network of hope, one symbol, one step, and one song at a time. While brave individuals risked everything to help enslaved people escape, the government, both state and federal, was actively working against them. Slavery wasn't just a Southern institution. It was embedded into the very legal and political framework of the United States, and two key laws made sure of that: the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act was the federal government's first major attempt to enforce the return of escaped slaves. It allowed slave owners, or those acting on their behalf, to seize alleged runaways in free states and bring them before a judge or magistrate. No jury trial was required, no evidence from the accused, In fact, the accused couldn't even testify in their own defense. All it took was a claim, and the person could be dragged back into bondage. This law also criminalized anyone who aided an escape, fining and prosecuting those who dared to help. But as more people escaped slavery, and as the abolitionist movement gained traction, Southern slaveholders demanded harsher enforcement. That led to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, part of the Compromise of 1850, and it was even more aggressive. Now federal commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled someone was a slave, and only $5 if they ruled they were free. It created a brutal incentive to rule in favor of slaveholders. It also forced ordinary citizens to participate. If you refused to help catch a fugitive slave, you could be fined or jailed. That meant even people in the North who morally opposed slavery were now legally obligated to support it. Slave catchers took full advantage. They stormed into northern towns, dragging people, sometimes even free black citizens, into custody. The law gave them enormous power, and local black communities lived in constant fear. Many who had escaped years earlier suddenly had to flee again, this time all the way to Canada, where American laws couldn't reach. But this heavy-handed approach backfired. In many parts of the North, the 1850 law triggered massive resistance. Crowds formed to stop slave catchers, prisons were broken into, courtrooms were mobbed. In Boston, for example, the arrest of fugitive slave Anthony Burns in 1854 sparked days of protests. A group of abolitionists even attempted a jailbreak, and the federal government had to send in troops to enforce his return, turning him into a symbol of injustice. In response, several northern states passed what were called personal liberty laws. These laws aimed to protect black residents and free citizens from being kidnapped under false pretenses. Some states required jury trials before anyone could be sent south. Others forbade state officials from cooperating with federal slave catchers at all. Essentially, these laws were a form of legal rebellion, pitting state law against federal mandates and further deepening the divide between North and South. The Fugitive Slave Acts reveal a critical truth. The fight over slavery wasn't just happening on plantations or battlefields. It was written into laws, enforced in courtrooms, and contested in city streets. It turned everyday people into agents of injustice or resistance, and it showed just how far the government was willing to go to preserve the system of slavery, and how far others were willing to go to defy it. The Underground Railroad played a pivotal role not only in the personal lives of those who escaped slavery, but also in the larger political and social landscape of the United States. Its influence reached deep into the nation's consciousness, acting as a symbol of both defiance and the hope for freedom in a time of growing sectional tension. As more enslaved people escaped to freedom, the existence of the Underground Railroad highlighted the deepening divide between the North and the South. For Southern slaveholders, the railroad was a direct affront to their way of life, a violent challenge to the economic foundation of their society. For Northern abolitionists, it represented a call to action. They could no longer ignore the brutality of slavery. It was no longer a distant problem. Fugitives and abolitionists forced the issue onto the national stage, making it impossible for the U.S. government to avoid addressing the question of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Acts and the escalating tensions in the 1850s, marked by violent confrontations like Bleeding Kansas, set the stage for the Civil War. The railroad's role in undermining slavery directly contributed to the push for abolition. As more people became involved in the fight for freedom, whether as conductors or sympathizers, the moral urgency grew. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison became more outspoken, and Abraham Lincoln, under pressure from both abolitionists and moderates, eventually issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The stories of those who escaped via the Underground Railroad and those who helped them were woven into the larger narrative of the Civil War. But after the war, much of this history was downplayed, forgotten, or even erased. In the years following Reconstruction, the narratives of enslaved people's agency were overshadowed by romanticized versions of the war and the heroic tales of Union soldiers. The myth of the lost cause, the idea that the South fought for noble reasons, became more widely accepted, minimizing the role that abolitionists and the Underground Railroad played in bringing about the end of slavery. Even today, The true legacy of the Underground Railroad is sometimes overlooked or simplified. While figures like Harriet Tubman are celebrated, the network of allies, the complexities of escape, and the sacrifices made by countless individuals remain underappreciated. Many of the stories of these freedom seekers and their conductors have been lost to time, not always honored in textbooks or public discourse. However, in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in understanding the true scope of the Underground Railroad's impact, not just as a network of escape, but as a fundamental part of the moral and political struggle that shaped the United States. The efforts of those involved in the railroad laid the foundation for the civil rights movement a century later, proving that the fight for freedom, dignity, and justice is a long, ongoing struggle. Today, as we look back at this legacy, we are reminded that the Underground Railroad was not just about physical escape. It was about resisting an unjust system and believing in the possibility of a more just future. Today, many historic sites related to the Underground Railroad stand as living memorials to the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of those who risked everything for freedom. These sites, from Harriet Tubman's home in Maryland to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, preserve the stories of freedom seekers and their conductors. They serve as educational resources, offering a place for reflection and understanding, ensuring that the history of the Underground Railroad is not forgotten. Preserving these sites and telling these stories is more important now than ever. In a world where systemic inequalities and racial injustices still persist, the Underground Railroad serves as a powerful reminder of the strength of individuals who resisted oppression. It teaches us about the transformative power of solidarity, community, and collective action in the face of unimaginable adversity. The legacy of the Underground Railroad continues to resonate in modern movements that advocate for liberation and justice. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, as well as current movements such as Black Lives Matter, draw inspiration from the spirit of resistance and courage embodied by those who fought against slavery. These modern struggles share the same fight for equality, the right to live without fear, and the demand for a society that values every individual's dignity. In many ways, the story of the Underground Railroad is far from over. Its lessons continue to guide activists, leaders, and everyday people who stand against oppression today. Just as the freedom seekers of the 19th century refused to accept a life of bondage, modern-day advocates for justice are similarly resisting the forces that perpetuate inequality, discrimination, and hate. The preservation of these stories reminds us that the struggle for freedom is ongoing, and the fight for liberation, rooted in the legacy of the Underground Railroad, is something we must all carry forward. As we wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect on the truths we've uncovered today. The real Underground Railroad wasn't just about tunnels or maps. It was a rebellion, a network of defiance, hope, and unyielding courage. It was driven by the determination of enslaved people seeking freedom and the selfless individuals who risked their lives to help them. While myths like quilt codes and secret lanterns have captured our imagination, the reality was much deeper. It was a relentless struggle for justice and liberation. The Underground Railroad was not just a path to the north. It was a symbol of resistance that transcended geography, rooted in the belief that everyone, regardless of race, deserved freedom. It wasn't just about escaping slavery. It was about fighting against a system that dehumanized people. These stories, from the bravery of Harriet Tubman to the quiet resistance of communities, remind us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how great the odds. But preserving this history is not just about remembering the past. It's about inspiring the future. The fight for freedom and justice continues. So, I encourage you to visit Underground Railroad historic sites, learn more about the lesser-known stories, and support efforts to preserve these sites. Dive deeper into the history that shaped our nation and recognize the ongoing legacy of resistance that still calls us to action today. The real Underground Railroad wasn't just a route to freedom. It was a rebellion built on hope, courage, and defiance. Let's keep that spirit alive.